Good evening, everyone. Hello, and I'm Holly Riebel with the Headwaters River Journey and Center, and thank you for joining in tonight. For those of you that are not familiar with Headwaters, we're a not-for-profit 501c3 dedicated to educating the public on water conservation and bringing more awareness about the important role the Headwaters plays in our environment, ecology, and Colorado lifestyle. Thank you again for joining us this is going to be a monthly speaker series. And tonight, our guest speaker is Jon Ewert. He's the aquatic biologist for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife for Grand and Summit counties since 2007. As the managing biologist for all of the area's fishery resources, Jon is heavily involved in multiple stakeholder groups and adaptive processes that aim to maximize the aquatic ecological health of the area. But before Jon starts his presentation, I want to make sure that the audience knows that there will be several opportunities throughout the presentation for you to ask questions. We ask that you keep your microphones muted, and if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. You can do that by looking at opening up the participants icon at the bottom of your Zoom, and on there you can actually raise your hand. Or you can ask a question in the chat room, which will be managed by Samantha Euchre, who's our general manager for Headwaters. So thank you, Samantha. We've also have Marissa too, Belcaster, who manages our Headwaters River Journey, and she'll be helping out too tonight. So now, please welcome Jon Ewert.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks everybody for your interest and for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so thanks again for your interest. My name is Jon Ewert. As Holly said, I'm the local fisheries biologist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about fisheries management on the Fraser River. And these fish that are in this shot are mottled sculpin, which I'm going to be talking about a lot because I'm often making the statement that they're the most important fish on the Fraser, and I'll understand a little bit, or I'll explain a little more about why that is as we go. So just a little bit by way of further introduction, Colorado Parks and Wildlife has 18 area offices around the state, and each one of those offices has a handful of wildlife officers that work out of that office, and then a terrestrial biologist who manages all the, big game types of species, a conservation biologist who manages non-game species, and then a fisheries biologist, and that's me. And so you may have been to our office in Hot Sulphur Springs down near Byers Canyon, and that's where my office is located. And so my responsibility is Grand and Summit counties, right here, Area 9, or every body of water that flows into the Colorado River down to State Bridge is my responsibility to manage all the fish populations in those water bodies. So first of all, just want to give you guys a little bit of background on kind of where I'm coming from and personal philosophy on decision making. A lot of the decision making that I'll be describing to you is sort of has its foundation in some of these ideas right off the bat. So this is the picture that I shared for the kind of the promotional or the biopic. I could have used this picture, which is out of the very same reach of river and is a more impressive fish, right? Well, why did I not use that picture? The reason why is because it is completely obvious that this is a fish that was stocked on private land and made its way into the river and is not a product of the river there. And the reason why I say that, and the reason why you can know that and be confident of that, is if you ever handle a rainbow trout of this size, and if you look closely at the fins, this fish has essentially no dorsal fin. That's, you couldn't, if you tried to lift that dorsal fin, it wouldn't lift any beyond what you can see right there. Its adipose fin is rubbed off, and also its tail, if you look at the fin rays, the bone rays in the tail, they're warped and they're turned inward. And those are all telltale signs that that fish was raised to a large size in a hatchery and stocked in that water. And so why do I bring this up? The reason I bring this up is because I want to manage our river and stream fisheries so that what people experience is a product. When you catch a fish, it is a product of the environment that you are fishing in. That is the entire reason why I'm a fisheries biologist today. That's what fascinated me about fishing as a young child, from my starting then to my entire life, is interacting with an animal that is a true product of its environment. And as time goes on in Colorado, we see more and more a movement toward a separation in the angling community from truly appreciating what's a product of its environment, as opposed to glamour shots with big, huge fish that are the size of steelhead. That's not a realistic fish for our waters in Grand County for the most part. It's not a realistic fish for any section of the Fraser River. It's just not going to grow fish that size, and that's okay. And so many of the decisions that I described to you are based around that principle of, you know, I want people to experience something that's a product of that environment. When you catch a rainbow trout in a place like the Fraser River or the Colorado River, how do you know whether it's a hatchery product or whether it grew there itself? Look at the tail on this fish. Look at the fin rays. The tail of that rainbow trout and this rainbow trout are straight and extremely clean. They come to clean points. Go back to that big fish and look at that tail, and that does not look very similar. And so that's one of the closest, easiest ways you can tell. And also the dorsal fin on that rainbow has nice straight fin rays that are not distorted, and that if you lift that dorsal fin, it stands straight up. Usually if a fish has been raised to a certain large catchable size in a hatchery and then stocked, it's not gonna, its fins are not gonna look like that. So, importance of the hypereic and riparian zones in the Fraser River. The Fraser is a little, small, fragile river, and it has some environmental stressors on it that sort of are constantly placing it under some amount of stress. And the thing that keeps the Fraser a healthy river as of today are these two absolutely critical things: the hypereic zone and the riparian zone. So as I go farther and farther in my career, I think more and more about the importance of the hypereic zone and the way that it contributes to our river ecology. And what the hypereic zone is everything down in the riverbed below where you have entered the world of cobbles and gravels and rocks, but it's not consolidated and there's still water moving through that environment. It's below the ground level of the riverbed. The other thing is the riparian zone, which is all the dense, thick, mature vegetation along the riverbanks that plays a very key role in defining the shape of that river and giving it physical structure. The hypereic zone, there are a lot of bugs that are very important to fish populations that are produced in the hypereic zone. And just another little diagram of the hypereic zone and how it works. It's kind of the border between groundwater and the surface water that flows down the river. And the thing about this zone is that if you send an unnaturally large amount of fine sediment down a river like the Fraser River, and you start to fill in all those gaps down in the riverbed, the river might not look very much different, but what you're doing is you're cutting off and strangling that zone, the hypereic zone. And there are a lot of critters that support the ecology of the river itself. And a river with that zone cut off is forever going to be um, uh, hindered in its full amount of productivity. The other thing that's really interesting about the hypereik zone is those other figures showed cross sections, but this is kind of just a real crude longitudinal picture here of how the water also flows, longitudinally. When you have a riffle, pool, run sequence in a river, and you have what's called the adverse slope at the downstream end of a pool, water is forced into that hypereik zone at where the slope is facing uphill, but the river is flowing. So the angle of the tail of the pool is the opposite of the direction that the river is flowing. Water is forced into that zone and flows beneath the surface of the riverbed. And one reason why that's so important is because if you spend any time watching trout or other fish in a stream like the Fraser spawning, they almost always choose the tail out, that adverse slope or near the riffle crest to spawn, because they place their eggs in the gravel, they bury them there, but their eggs will have a constant supply of water because they instinctively know the water is being forced into the hypereik zone there and will give them that constant supply of oxygenated water that the eggs need while they're incubating. Anyway, moving on to mottled sculpin. So these are the most important fish in the Fraser River. They're the key indicator, one of the key indicators that we have a healthy hypereik zone in the Fraser River. And the reason for that is because they live in the gaps in between the cobbles down in the riverbed. And when they spawn, they build nests on the undersides of those rocks. And so if those spaces in between the cobbles in the riverbed are full of sediments, that's the habitat for these fish, and these fish won't be there. They're native fish. They rarely get larger than 5 inches long, but they're absolutely gorgeous. And they outnumber trout by a fairly large amount in the Fraser River. There's almost literally one under every cobble in the Fraser. They're by far the most numerous fish species, but they're also very valuable in supporting our recreational fishery. Brown trout love these things. And if you've ever caught a brown trout on a woolly bugger, on a brown or olive or black woolly bugger, that fish is in all likelihood interpreting that woolly bugger as a sculpin. The other thing about that hypereik zone is we've got a lot of bugs that are really important that live down there. And this is just one example of giant stonefly, which we do have some giant stoneflies on the Fraser River, mainly in the lower end of the Fraser River Canyon, but they're heavily dependent on having those interstitial spaces in the cobbles in the riverbed. The other thing that's important about sculpin distribution in Grant County is that in the sculpin population, the Fraser River is essentially isolated from other river reaches. When you get down to the town of Granby to Windy Gap Reservoir, we have no sculpin in the main stem Colorado River from Granby down to Kremling. We don't know precisely why that is, but we're pretty sure that it's because the cobble riffles in this stretch of the Colorado River are embedded, and those interstitial spaces in between the cobbles have filled in over time because the river doesn't have enough power to keep it flushed out, and therefore there's no habitat for mottled sculpin. They should be there. They should be there in very high densities, and they're native fish there. But so the effect of that is that in the Fraser, we've got a very prolific mottled sculpin population, but it is isolated to just the Fraser River, making them more vulnerable to disturbance or habitat degradation if that were to happen over time. So let's shift gears here and talk about how do I manage the fish populations in the Fraser River. That's kind of the basis for all the decision making that I do is my survey stations, where we survey fish populations on an annual basis. And I've got a lot of locations up and down the river. Some of them I hit every year. Some of them I hit every couple or every few years. But these are most of the stations. There are a few that are not on this map that I've hit at one point or another. But we go out to the river and we electrofish. And I've saw some familiar names on the list of folks who are attending tonight, and I know that so many of you know how this works. But for those that don't, I assemble a crew of volunteers. We have electrofishing equipment that puts electricity into the water, and we wade from downstream to upstream on an established reach of river, and we collect every fish we can. We hold them in a pen, and we go back through and we do it a second time, which gives us the statistics we need to see how much we depleted the population to give us our population estimate. And then we collect all the data that we need off of those fish, and then we return them back to that reach of the river. Most of my rivers population monitoring stations are about 600 feet long, because that on a river the size of the Fraser, that tends to encompass about 3 pool riffle run sequences. And so we get a good solid representative sample of what the fish population is in that part of the river. So from here going forward, I'm going to work my way kind of from the top down and talk about sort of each established station that I have on the Fraser River and what it tells us about the river, and what that information has done to help inform fish management decisions that I make. So the highest up station that I have is the Robber's Roost. I call it Robber's Roost. It's not precisely at the Robber's Roost campground, but if you're familiar with Bertha Pass, everybody knows these switchbacks on the Winter Park side. Down here close to the lower switchback is Robber's Roost campground itself. My station is actually 600 feet of river down in this dispersed camping area, a little bit farther downstream. And so the main environmental stressor that the Fraser River experiences in this reach, close to the headwaters, is a huge volume of highway sand that gets input into the river. And you can see just through this satellite photo, you can see vast quantities of highway sand sloughing down the mountainside below from the highway. All that highway sand works its way down into the river. And we have, there was a cooperative project about 15 years ago to construct a sand collection pond that gets emptied out every year. And that's fantastic because that prevents that sand from working its way farther down the Fraser River. But this section of the river is upstream of that sediment collection basin. And so it experiences the stress of having this excess, this higher than normal amount of sediment input into the river, which it may or may not be capable of carrying out in any given year. So I didn't start surveying this reach until 2019. And I just hadn't really focused on the far upstream end of the Fraser much before that point. One reason is knowing that it's a relatively poor fishery because of the stress of that highway sand. So I hadn't focused on it all that much. But in 2019, I established this station, went up there to see what kind of fish population we had. And it's 100% brook trout, no sculpin that far upstream, no brown trout or rainbows either. And relatively small size structure and pretty sparse. 26 pounds per surface acre is a sparse trout population, and 191 fish over 6 inches per mile is not very many. That's per mile of stream. And so, and as an aside, I'll be talking about pounds per surface acre quite a bit. That's our biomass estimate, and that's how we compare the productivity of trout fisheries in rivers of different size. We measure the average width of the stream, in the reach where we're measuring the fish population, and therefore we can compare, the productivity of this stretch of river to, say, the Colorado River down by Pump House, even though they're vastly different. If we do it in terms of surface acre of water, it makes it comparable. Anyway, 26 pounds per acre is a very low, pretty sparse fish population. So when I saw that, I got to thinking, well, this stress of highway sand, the big influx of highway sand that occurs every year is during spring runoff and probably on the front end of spring runoff, right? When on the ascending limb of the hydrograph, when all the snow is melting at the beginning, that's kind of when a lot of the stuff gets knocked loose. A lot of debris and sediment inputs get knocked loose for the first time as the stream is on its way up. And brook trout spawn in the fall. So they spawn in September, place their eggs in the gravel, and then the eggs incubate over the course of the winter. And then the fry emerge from the gravel the following spring, April or May, probably May in this location because it's high elevation. And anyway, so it's during the time that those eggs are incubating that highway sand comes into the river. So if you think about the timing of this, I got to thinking, well, cutthroats are spring spawners. And in a high elevation location like this, we say spring spawner, but what that means is they're going to be spawning, sometime after June 15th. They spawn at the top or the descending limb of the hydrograph when runoff is starting to drop. And so I got to thinking, well, maybe cutthroats, if we could get cutthroats established here, we have a very sparse brook trout population. We could potentially get cutthroats established just by stocking them, and they may have a competitive advantage over brook trout numbers wise, simply because of the dynamics that I just described about brook trout spawn and maybe some difficulty that they have spawning. So I went ahead and stocked 10,000 2.6-inch long cutthroat fingerlings in late September of 2019 for the first time, just because I had them available and it's kind of became a pet project. We usually don't stock cutthroats on top of established brook trout populations because they just become food for the brook trout in general. But this was a relatively unique situation where we had a sparse brook trout fishery that for the reasons that I described. And also I had some larger cutthroats available. Most of the cutthroats that we stock, when we stock cutthroats, they're usually 1 inch. They're not very long. But we have a small number in our hatchery system of cutthroats that get held over an extra season and they're available at a larger size. So these are 2.6 inches. There's a nice brook trout from that reach. So we came back in 2020. Forgot to put a legend on here, but the light gray bars are the cutthroats that we had stocked the year before. So those fish had been in the river for about 11 months now, and they were averaging 4 inches. So that doesn't seem like a very fast growth rate, but the Fraser is an extremely cold river that far upstream. So I was actually really pleased with what we found, that we had good survival, what I consider to be pretty good survival, 528 fish per mile on those cutthroats. We got about maybe 2 miles of river that we're going to try to have this cutthroat population established. So, if we've got 1,000 fish out there, 10% survival off of stocked 2 fingerlings the year before in a place as harsh as the Fraser River over the winter that's good. That's as good as I can hope for. So that's a little, like I said, my little pet project up in the very farthest upstream reaches of the Frasers. I'm going to attempt to do some conversion up there from a brook trout fishery to a cutthroat fishery, and we'll see how well we do. So I am going to pause there because we're going to move downstream and talk about some other stuff. But does anybody have any questions at this point?
No.
Questions? No?
Okay.
Okay.
Very good, though.
Okay. Thanks. Whoops.
Hey, John. Sorry, I couldn't get to my button quick enough. My name's Steve. I'm curious, what kind of cutthroat did you put in there?
They're Colorado River cutthroats. They are what we call blue lineage Colorado River cutthroats. We have 2 different lineages of Colorado River cutthroats, blue lineage and green lineage. They're both native to the Colorado River watershed as a whole. Blue lineage are native to the Yampa and the green river headwaters, in state of Colorado, the Yampa and the White River. And blue lineage, I'm sorry, I reverse that. Blue lineage are native to the Yampa and the white. Green lineage are native to the Colorado and the Gunnison and the San Juan, and so or the Uncompahgre. So they are blue lineage cutthroat, which are not the strain that are native, but it's a smaller separation than subspecies. You know, if you follow me, they're still the native species, but they're not the exact strain that's native here. The reason why I did not stock the exact strain that's native here is because we don't have a brood stock available, and we're not raising that strain of fish to 2.6 inches. They're pretty rare on the landscape, and we don't have a captive brood stock that we're producing 3-inch fingerlings with. So it'll always be, I mean, if we get successful reproduction, that'll be great, and we'll count it as a conservation population. But it's in my mind, it's more of a recreation population than purely a conservation population, especially because of where, you know, I'm establishing them. It has some environmental stressors, has a lot of public access, et cetera, et cetera.
Hey,
Okay,
John,
now
we have one other question about how do you volunteer?
Oh, I will put my email address up on the last slide of my talk, and you can feel free to drop me an email and say, hey, I want to be on your volunteer list, and I maintain a mailing list of interested volunteers. So thanks for that. Okay, moving downstream. First of all, before I talk about the next section going downstream, I want to describe what I've done with the rainbow trout stocking on the Fraser River, on this section of the Fraser River, essentially from the town of Fraser River going upstream. I've always been interested in trying to establish a self-sustaining population of whirling disease-resistant rainbows on this section of the Fraser. I say whirling disease-resistant because we've developed strains over the past decade that are resistant to this parasite. And this parasite, as you may know, knocked out much of our wild self-sustaining rainbow trout fisheries around the state in the 80s and 90s. But we've developed strains of rainbow that are resistant to the parasite. So we're going through kind of a iterative process around the state of trying to establish these resistant genetics in our rainbow trout to try to foster natural reproduction once again for the first time, you know, in many of these places for the first time since the mid 80s, when the parasite first made it into our waters. So what happened on the Fraser is the towns of Fraser and Winter Park and a number of partners did a bunch of habitat work on the Cozen's Ranch open space and some of the other reaches of the Fraser back in 2004, 2005. And so starting in 2006 and 2007, we started loading it up with rainbows after that habitat work was done to try to occupy habitat to give rainbows a bit of an advantage. And that's what those batches in 2007 and 2008 are. We stocked some large fish. We were just basically throwing every size of rainbow that we had at the river to occupy habitat and to try to encourage rainbows to take up residence and start reproducing. So for a short period of time, we stocked a small number of large fish. That was never a long-term plan. Then starting in 2010, as the first year that the whirling disease-resistant rainbow strains became available to us, and I started stocking approximately 50,000 fish every year, and stocking them as small as I could get them. I really like stocking those 1-inch fish. We stock them by hand, we sprinkle them around, we stock them in the fry habitat. The thing about stocking 1-inch rainbows in fry habitat by hand, it's more labor intensive, but the thing is they're not inclined to run out into the river channel where they're gonna immediately encounter a hungry brown trout. 1-inch fish want to stay in fry habitat until they figure out what they're doing and where they are. And so places with some grasses and aquatic vegetation that gives them cover, those are the perfect kinds of places to stock fry that will then, you know, be a more wild type fish. They may not have been born there, but they're more wild type fish once they do become of a larger size. So you can see that there's a 6-year gap. 2014 through 2019, I didn't stock any rainbows in the Fraser, and I'll show you why that is. But in 2020, for the first time since 2013, I stocked rainbows again in the Fraser. And as we go, you'll see why that is. So moving downstream to Idlewild Campground. This is the next station down. And now this is downstream of the Moffat Tunnel diversion point, where a portion of the water for the Fraser leaves and goes under the mountains over to ends up in Gross Reservoir and supplying part of the Denver water supply system. And so, but it is downstream of the place where we have our settlement basin where the highway sand gets removed from the river. So you remove one environmental stressor and you add a different one in the form of lower than normal or lower than natural stream flows at times when the Moffat Tunnel is taking water. So you may know the Idlewild Campground, right where the bike path goes through, beautiful spot there just upstream of the town of Winter Park, downstream of where Highway 40 goes over the Fraser. Here's, I've been doing this section every other year. And here are these are our biomass estimates for brook brown and rainbow trout. We've got all 3 species now down there. And you can see that in 2014, we had a good robust population of rainbow trout. Remember that 2013 was the last year that I stocked rainbows. And we have kind of a varying density of brown trout and a pretty consistent density of brook trout. Browns seem to be kind of, in this one and the next station down, they're kind of wanting to try to colonize upstream in the Fraser. It appears to me that they're trying to make a movement upstream. Any place where you have brown trout, most of our small mountain streams that have brook trout and brown trout have an elevational switch. At some point in the elevation, as you go downstream, it switches from being brook trout dominated to being brown trout dominated. And the Fraser River is the same way. And that's determined by temperature. They have different temperature preferences. And so one thing that I've seen over the past few years is it appears to me that there's an upstream movement of brown trout going on in the Fraser River, which is really interesting. The other thing that we see here is that this far up the river, rainbows, it became evident to me that the rainbows that we had stocked from 10 through 13 were not going to sustain themselves without the aid of additional stocking. We went from 33 pounds per surface acre in 2014 down to none in 2000. Whoops, that is a typo on the right-hand side. That's supposed to say 2020. We were just there this year. And we had a biomass estimate of 0 pounds per acre of rainbows. And we do pick up sculpin for the first time down here, and but not upstream of Highway 40. I believe, as far as I can tell, and the data that I've collected, that highway crossing of Highway 40, where it crosses where the Fraser River crosses under Highway 40, appears to be the boundary of where we have sculpin occurring downstream of that, and we do not have them upstream of that. Brook size distribution of brook trout is just kind of very similar to what we saw upstream. They're topping out at 10 inches, and you're not going to find a fish larger than 10 inches, or it will be very rare if you do. That's a function of temperature for the most part. The Fraser's still a really cold river up there, and if you're only growing a couple inches a year, you don't, it takes you a while to get to 10 inches long. So, given mortality rates, you're just not going to get there. However, I showed you that we did stock rainbow trout again for the first time in 2020. We picked up 1,300 of them. This is we stocked them in late June. So July, August. Well, so we're 3 months after we stocked them, and we picked up 1,300. So we had real good survival, at least over the summer, of those rainbow trout that we stocked. So we will be seeing rainbow trout increasing their numbers again. Moving downstream to Confluence Park. This is in the town of Winter Park. There's the old Idlewild tennis courts, which I believe they're no longer now. There was a lot of disturbance in this area this past year. Lots of days with turbidity in the water, lots of fine sediment going into the water, and we received a lot of calls from concerned people about the turbidity of the Fraser River this summer, which was a little bit distressing. There was a massive amount of disturbance going on the Fraser with all the construction. this past year. You may be familiar with this mobility impaired deck here that somebody can actually be sitting in a wheelchair and cast into a beautiful pool right there, drift to fly through that nice pool. It's a really sweet spot. But anyway, our station goes right up here. The confluence of Vasquez Creek is under the trees right here at kind of the lower right. And that's the upstream end of our 600-foot reach of river that we survey there. There we are on that stretch of river. So this has been a really dynamic situation on this reach of river, and it's been really interesting to watch. And the gaps here are the years that we did not survey. We haven't hit this one every year. But as you can see, rainbow trout did really well in those years that I was stocking them, and held on for a few years beyond that, and their numbers dwindled away. They did not sustain themselves at the numbers that they reached while I was stocking and for the couple of years after. What's really interesting about this is the rainbow trout were so successful that for at least a couple of years there, they suppressed the brook trout population in that reach, and that is a rare thing. Brook trout are really prolific and tend to be very competitively dominant in a stream like the Fraser at that elevation. And to be stocking these rainbows at 1 or 3 inches and to have them squeeze out the brook trout and for it to be totally dominated by rainbow trout for a couple of years was a really interesting thing to me. And rainbows maintained themselves, through 2015 at higher densities than the brook trout. And that was a real shocker to me. And then you can see that once rainbow numbers started going down, brook trout biomass started coming up. But the other thing that's been going on in this reach that's also fascinating is brown trout have established more of a foothold. The last 3 times we've been out there since 2017, we have higher brown trout biomass than we've ever seen in this reach. So that goes back to that theme of brown trout starting to assert themselves higher up the Fraser River. Here's what the size distribution of the brown trout, or the rainbow trout and the brook trout, the rainbows and the brook trout back in 2012 when they were kind of at their peak. This is 3-year classes. You can see clearly 3-year classes of those rainbow trout that I stocked at 2 inches, 6 inches, and 9 inches. That's what that looked like on the ground. And the coloration on those fish is just gorgeous. Once, when they go in at a small size and they grow up as a wild type fish in the Fraser, give me a 9-inch fish that looks like that, and I'll catch that any day over a 18-inch hatchery product. And then moving forward, you'll remember that 2013 was the last year we stocked rainbows, and so you'll see a lack of reproduction as we go forward in time. And kind of starting in 2015, we had few enough rainbows in the system now that the brook trout again produced big year classes and moved right back in and started dominating the numbers of fish. You can see a second strong year class here in the 2017 data. And then those brown trout starting to show up. And the interesting thing about the brown trout showing up in that area it was not just a spawning movement of mature fish, because the first time, in 2017, the first time we had 20 pounds per acre of brown trout, we had 4 year classes represented there. We've got 18 inches, this year class at 8 to 11 inches, another year class down here at 4 to 6. And then we have, a couple young of the years at 2 inches. So, like the sudden appearance of multiple age classes of brown trout working their way up the Fraser, really interesting. 2018, kind of more the same, except real dwindling numbers of rainbows. A little bit of, now we're this far, we're 5 years out from rainbow trout being stocked. And so we know for certain that these fish, the fish at 2 inches here and the fish at 5 to 7 are the result of natural reproduction. So a small amount of natural reproduction occurring, that is the only possible origin of those fish. However, not in adequate numbers to sustain themselves over time. You see this small amount of natural reproduction and, your numbers are going to be declining. 2020, again, those are the fish that we stocked again for the first time. We're down to almost nothing on our rainbow trout population. And there's our rainbows that we stocked in 2020, and larger by a couple inches than those 2-inch brook trout that were born in 2020. So I expect to see them again exerting that competitive pressure on brook trout and being a rainbow dominated fishery in that reach for at least the next few years. I'm going to switch gears a little bit as we go downstream. So I'm going to stop again and ask if anybody has any other questions.
Anyone? Hey, John, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So what are you seeing? Are you the next few years, especially with drought and the fires we've seen, what are some of your biggest concerns that you're going to see in terms of impact? Or what are your predictions for even the next 5-10 years? I mean, I don't know if that's too far out, but.
Well, you know, it's really hard to say what kind of weather conditions we're going to have as far as droughts. You know, the Fraser has, I didn't put a graph in there that shows peak flows on the Fraser, but one thing the Fraser has had going for it since about 2011 is a lot of decent water years. The only real poor water year we've had was 2012, where the highest flow of the whole year was about 150 CFS. Mm-hmm. We've had some astronomically high flows on the Fraser since 2011. It hit over 2,000 CFS in 2011. 2014 was a huge year. And so, you know, if we go for a long period of time without those good flushing flows, 1 year of low water, 2 years of low water, these streams are resilient and you get other benefits from having low water years. But, you know, my biggest concern is if we go into a 3 or 4 or longer drought, you know, that multi-year drought that we're all afraid of lurking out there, you know, that we're statistically overdue for. We've had individual dry years here and there. We've had dry periods of dry years, but we have not had a 3 to 4 year stretch of true drought since 01, 02, 03. And that is a long time. So that's my biggest concern for the Fraser. You know, the other thing is, knock on wood, I hate to even say anything like this, but, you know, a bunch of Grand County is burned now, but the Fraser Valley is not burned. Mm-hmm. And there's just as much fuel in the Fraser Valley as there was in the areas that did burn. So let's hope we don't see anything along those lines.
Yeah.
So, John, I had a question. This is Paul Moss. On the rainbow trout and the struggle to basically be successful in reproduction, is that solely attributable to competition with brook trout, or is there something else playing in that?
It depends on the reach of river. On that Confluence Park reach, I believe that's still a cold, forested mountain stream, and I believe that the temperature regime in that reach favors brook trout over rainbow trout.
Yeah, it's really shady there.
Yeah, it's shady. It's a cold river still up there. It changes a lot as you go downstream, but it's still a cold river up there. And so if you think about a fall spawner putting their eggs in the gravel in September and then the fry being able to emerge in May, rainbow trout eggs aren't even going into the gravel until May. And so those brook trout fry are way, you know, they're ready to outcompete or even prey upon the fry for any rainbow that are, you know, fry in that reach. Rainbow trout fry might emerge in July under that cold temperature regime. So by that time, the brook trout for that year are well established and ready to outcompete the rainbow. So I think it's a direct competitive issue on that stretch of river. Farther downstream, I don't think that's the case, and I'll get to that a little bit.
Because of temperature downstream.
Yeah, because the temperature is more favorable. Yep.
Thanks.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
We had a little event that was really interesting in 2019 down on the Cozens Ranch open space. If you're familiar with this reach of river, here's the fly shop here, and then the fishing ponds here. We had the river changed course a little bit. We got some calls. Well, the first call that I got was that Denver water had dried up the Fraser River, and there were dying fish. And the origin of that call was somebody on this bike path back here that had seen this loop of the river go dry. And it's always disconcerting when a river goes dry, there's no question about that. But this was a totally natural process. And what had happened was that it was helped along by beaver ponds. The river left its banks right here and cut off this loop. And there were some beaver dams here. This is a highly complex, really hard to walk around back here, messy stretch of river. But the thing is, these are the processes that make it so biologically valuable. And so it did abandon this loop in the river, but the river was set up for that to happen. Here's where this avulsion happened, cut off this loop. But if you look at the radius of that loop in the river, this is a natural process that rivers go through. And, you know, this end of the loop over here, the river is flowing up the valley, up the direction of the valley. When you have loops looping back on themselves like that, you know, the movement of the river over time creates that, but it also creates cutoffs when that happens. And so this is a purely natural process. And the thing that we should be grateful for is the planning that went into place that established this Cousins Ranch open space property. This is the biological battery of the entire Fraser River. And it's hard to stress how important this reach of river is and how valuable it is that the people who laid out the planning for this originally left this riparian area intact. The big mature willows in there, and all those processes that go along with them. The undercut banks are just pricelessly valuable in the ecological health of the Fraser River. It's that piece of property and pieces of property like it that give it resilience to these environmental stressors that we're talking about. If you denude the banks, get rid of all that willow and build paths along both sides of the river, build infrastructure right up to the edges of the water, that resilience is gone. This is like a battery that maintains the ecological health of the Fraser River, and we need to hope that it stays that way in perpetuity, because it is hugely valuable and beneficial for the Fraser. So my next station going downstream is what we call the Safeway station, right behind Safeway there, if you're familiar with where that is. And this is a really interesting reach because it kind of reflects that really rich biological productivity and health of that Cousins Ranch reach of the Fraser River. And as you can see, trout biomass is through the roof here. Now, this is a very heavily fished reach of river, very heavily. This stretch of river gets fished pretty much every day, if not multiple times a day. People are wading through it fishing. And yet it has some of the highest biomass of trout in the entire Fraser River. And so why is that? It's the reason is the complexity of habitat. Every bend pool, every bank has mature overhanging willow. There's little undercuts all over the place. Undercut banks on a river that's as small as the Fraser are very important trout habitat, and they're very hard to replicate artificially. So the mature willow and the structure that it creates and provides in this reach of river is just, it's hard to overstate how valuable and important it is. So we've got, you can see those trends in the rainbow trout that reflect the history of the stocking. These are over here in the 2006 to 2008 time frame, are artificially inflated with those large fish that we stocked right after the habitat project was done. And then starting in 2011 is a reflection of the success of those whirling disease resistant strains that we stocked. 2013 was the last year that we stocked, and you can see that the rainbows did maintain their numbers a little bit better in this reach. And now they're finally starting to dwindle down to the point where they're a fraction of the density of the brown trout that are present. And I'm feeling like bolstering their numbers a little bit. We've had an increase in brown trout over these years also. And again, I think it's probably, I don't know all the reasons for that. It's number one, it's the success of the habitat project that was done all the way back in 04 and 05. And it's also the, probably has a lot to do with the succession of good water years that we've had, that we haven't had that extreme drought stressing the fish population, that it's just been able to build and build over that time. You can see back in 2003, it was in very, very poor shape. That was before the habitat project and in the third year of a bad drought. And I hope we never get down to those kind of numbers again. I don't think we will, because of the resilience of that Cousins Ranch open space now and the condition that it's in now compared to back then. Fish over 14 inches per surface acre. This is a new metric that I haven't showed you, because up to this point, we haven't had significant numbers of fish over 14 inches. But once you get down to Cousins Ranch open space, you do have fish over 14 inches. And rainbows they were holding their own in terms of the large fish component of the fishery. They were holding their own against browns for a few years, and now browns are winning that fight. And sculpin numbers, we're down in much higher density sculpin, and pretty consistent numbers on that reach of the Fraser, usually around 200 that we get down there. There's that management goal of mine for the Fraser River, nice 15-inch wild type, beautiful rainbow. And this is what our nets look like this year on those fingerlings. That's those 2020 fish that we stocked. So looking at the size distribution of rainbows versus browns in that Safeway reach, this is starting in 2015. So we have natural reproduction occurring. You can see the natural reproduction. And every year I would go out there and say, man, we've got more 2-inch rainbows than we have 2-inch browns here. The year classes of these rainbows were prolific and just as good as the brown trout. And yet the following year, look at this year class of rainbows in 2015, advance it forward to 2016, and we've got almost none. We have no age 1 year class. This is what we call the age 0 year class. The fish born that year, go forward to the next year, those fish should be in that 5 to 8 inch range, and they're just not there. Again, in 2016, juvenile rainbows outnumber the browns, yet we don't have any age 1s in 2017. You know, and we keep that theme kind of repeats itself. We finally had a big year class in 2018. I don't know what the conditions were that created that, but we had the best year class of wild reproduced rainbow trout that we've seen in 2018, which did actually form an age 1 year class in 2019 for the first time. But I had already made the decision that we were going to stock again in 2020. But these 10-inch rainbows out there are the product of natural reproduction. Anything larger than 6 inches in that reach of the Fraser, as of right now, is a naturally produced rainbow. But now these 3 or 4 inchers in this year, they're going to hit 6 to 8 inches. And then the following year, they'll be in that 10-inch catchable size range. So I believe what we've got going on in this reach is that we're losing the resistance to whirling disease over successive generations of wild fish born in the river. Our strains that we have in the hatchery that produce the eggs that we stock, that produce the 1-inch fish that we stock, are highly resistant to whirling disease. But it appears, and we've seen this in a few other places in the state, that that resistance is breeding out over a few generations. And so this is our next challenge in fine-tuning the genetics of our wild rainbow stocks, is how do we get away from this dynamic we're seeing where they lose resistance over successive generations. So the effect of stocking them in 2020, so these fish, the 2018 year class that are now at 10 inches long, have withstood the challenge of whirling disease infection. So these are going to be resistant fish. And we're just bolstering the genetics of the whirling disease resistance by introducing and intermixing an additional shot of WD resistant fish in 2020. into that population. So moving downstream, we'll have some other topics. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, crickets. I'll keep going and be pretty close to wrapping it up at 7:30 or for final discussions or questions. Moving downstream to the Fraser Flats reach. So this is the section that recently was opened to public access just a few years ago, and it's Grand County Water and Sanitation property. And you may be familiar with the multi-agency stakeholder group called Grand County Learning by Doing that we are a participant in, also Denver Water, Northern Water, U.S. Forest Service, Grand County, Trout Unlimited, and some other folks are all working together in an adaptive management process to do projects to enhance the ecological health and protect the ecological health of the Fraser and the other waterways in Grand County. So this was a habitat project that we conducted on this reach of river where we narrowed the channel. You may be familiar with stretches of the Fraser that are like this. On the left, this is a before and after picture. So what we have here is an overwide channel at low flows, overwide and featureless channel, which has barely any or almost none adult trout holding water for adult trout anywhere in it. An adult trout doesn't want to come anywhere near this because there's no cover and there's no water even deep enough for them to reside in. And so when you have that type of a situation, one way to improve the habitat is to go in and narrow up the channel and do these point bar enhancements, which is what this is a picture of, where you have narrowed the channel, and by narrowing the channel, you're increasing the power of the stream to keep those riffles nice and clean, keep those interstitial spaces clear, like we were talking about. And also deepens the pools, deepens the runs, and enhances your adult trout habitat by doing that. And so we did that on a little over, it was, what was it? About, I think close to a mile of river. It was a public-private partnership. Some of it was on Devil's Thumb property. Some of it was on this reach that the public has access to. So we got a little bit of a mixed story here on this project. It was spectacularly successful when we built it in the fall of 2017. This is from 2016 to 2017 is the increase that we saw immediately after the habitat project was built. And then each time we've gone out there after that, our numbers have dwindled. This is, not what we wanted to see, not what we were hoping for, but what can we learn from this? It's not I don't consider the project to be a failure, because the physical attributes that we changed are still there. That narrower channel profile, the better features of the stream are still in place. So the project hasn't fallen apart physically from that perspective, but our trout population is back down to, at or below where it was before we built the project. So why is that happening? Well, there's a few things that I think are probably going on here. Number one, since it's a newer section of river that's available to the public to fish, it has had a huge amount of fishing pressure in the past few years since it's been open. There's a lot of people fishing it, and the public reach is relatively short, and there's private water both immediately above and immediately below these reaches, and it's very easy. There are no physical barriers or impediments to fish movement, which is how we want it. We want fish to be able to move around as they need to. But when you have a high amount of pressure concentrated on a short stretch of river and much less fishing pressure on both ends of that, eventually the fish figure out that they can move out and be pressured less. And so I think some of that is going on. The other thing that happened in 2020 is I think that estimate is artificially low because we had a very weird spawn timing in the fall of 2020, along with many other things that were very weird in the fall of 2020. The brown trout spawned early and they spawned over a very short window of time. And so what we saw in that Fraser Flats Reach when we were out there on October 3rd was, I think that the adult brown, well, we saw spawning beds that had been used and were already vacant. I think the browns had spawned early and they had left and they had headed down to the canyon for overwinter habitat as a drought response. And I talked to other people, my counterparts around the state, and other people saw the same kind of dynamic going on this last fall. Fall spawning fish, it's a lot like aspens in a drought, like we had this last year, where they turn early and the colors are there for a short period of time and it's over with quickly. That's exactly how brown trout spawn went down this past fall. And so I think that the fish that would have been there in a more normal year had already left and gone to overwinter habitat. It's like they're throwing in the towel on that growing season, saying, I'm going to winter habitat, see you next year kind of thing. So, if that wasn't the case, I'm optimistically thinking that at least our numbers would have been more along the lines of what they were before we built the habitat project. And so still, that doesn't get us to, the 120 plus pounds per acre that we saw right after we built the habitat project. So what would? The other thing that went along with the habitat project is a big volunteer effort headed up by the local TU chapter and other volunteers to plant willows along this reach of the Fraser. The thing that this reach does not yet have, that the Cousins Ranch, look at the contrast between the willow community on this reach compared with the Cousins Ranch open space. On a river the size of the Fraser, you can do all the habitat work you want to inside the high water lines of the river, but something I'm learning over the years is that there is nothing that replaces that mature, complex willow community all over the banks of the river. And we really need to keep working to get that back on as much of the Fraser River as we can, because that's the other component. The habitat work is great and it's still maintaining itself, but the other component of it that is equally or even more important is getting those willows to grow and proliferate. The one thing we did see that was really awesome and kind of a highlight and a milestone for me, I'm always looking at what fish are eating. And for the first time, I was able to document a sculpin that had a young of the year brown trout in its stomach on that Fraser Flats Reach this year. That was pretty sweet. So, turnabout is fair play. Brown trout love to eat those mottled sculpin, but if the timing is right and the situation is right, the sculpin don't have any problem eating young of the year browns either. So that's pretty cool to be able to document that. So this is just looking at the some cross sections that I've measured on that habitat project. In after the project was built, we improved the width to depth ratio. We talk about width to depth ratio. This is the same location on the river, looking at the depth of the water, and our width to depth ratio is still improved. It's half of what it was before the project was built, which is great. So this is just the evidence that we have that the what the project is performing as it was intended and as it was designed. It's just that you have to have that complex overhead cover that only a mature willow community is going to provide. So that's what I have for tonight. I went on about the amount of time that I had planned. So I've got other information from farther down the Fraser, but I thought that was probably going to take up the whole hour. I don't want to drone on too long and bore people to death. But if anybody has any questions or any other topics for conversation, now's the time to bring that stuff up.
Anyone have a question?
Just a quick one, if I could. John,
Sure.
do you think that the Windy Gap bypass, when and if that happens, will in any way affect the quality of the Fraser?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thanks for bringing it up. That's a very exciting project that folks have probably been hearing about that is on the verge of getting built. And what it will do is it will take Windy Gap Reservoir and make it from an on-channel reservoir to an off-channel reservoir and reconnect the Colorado and the Fraser upstream and downstream around Windy Gap. Right now, no fish can get past Windy Gap Reservoir if they want to move upstream. Fish can move downstream through Windy Gap, but it's a one-way valve essentially. So if you take those factors into consideration, it's hard to imagine it being, it's not going to be a negative. At worst, above it, I'm not sure what effect it's going to have upstream of the Fraser River Canyon. It's going to help the overall ecology of the entire system in Grand County. How much we see identifiable change upstream of the Fraser River Canyon, I'm not so sure, because that's a real kind of ecological nick point or changeover point. I think it will definitely be noticeable in the Fraser up to the mouth of the Fraser River Canyon, all the way through Granby Ranch property. We've always seen quite a bit of rainbow trout reproduction, even through all the whirling disease years. The Granby Ranch reach of river, for whatever reason, has always hosted the most rainbow trout reproduction that I've seen. Even when rainbow trout numbers are at their lowest point on the Fraser River, that section on the Granby Ranch, you can find the most juvenile rainbows there as anywhere. And I've always had a pet theory that is like the last shreds of a dynamic that used to happen with rainbow trout from the main stem of the Colorado River running up to that vicinity of the Fraser River to spawn and to recruit into the Colorado River from there. And my hope is that is what we will see again, is movements of fish up into the mouth of the Fraser River Canyon or beyond during spawning times. The more you can allow trout to move to find habitat that they need any given time of year, the better off the fishery is going to be. And that's what that's going to accomplish for us.
Great, thanks, John.
Sure. Anybody have any other questions or topics?
No? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, thank
Great
you,
presentation.
John. Thanks. That was fabulous and very informative presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And our next speaker series actually is March 23rd. And we're going to be featuring Matt Rice with American Rivers and Paul Brochet, local rancher that a lot of you know. Their presentation will discuss the increasing pressures in the Colorado River Basin, what they're facing, the impacts on our environment and agriculture. So this would be a great session. So please join us. Go to headwatersriverjourney.com and you can go ahead and register for that coming up here.
Oh, can I make one more plug also?
Please do.
Also next month on, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing. What was that date? I'm sorry. I'm looking it up real quick.
I think was it the 15th? No.
16th, Tuesday, March 16th. I will be doing the same thing, only hosted by the Headwaters TU chapter. And it'll be kind of a companion talk, and I'm going to talk about fisheries management on the Colorado River in Grand County. So no overlap in these talks. It'll be a whole different topic. We'll get into more of the Windy Gap bypass probably, and some other stuff too. So
how do we join that one?
If you follow the Headwaters chapter, I'm not sure if they have a Facebook page.
Okay, if it's on Headwaters, I got it. Okay.
Yeah. It'll be promoted by the Headwaters chapter.
Yeah.
Good.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And again, John, thank you so much. You did a great job. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing everybody on our other events. Just go ahead and look on our calendar and see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.